All right, so in this last section here, we're really going to talk about kind of how we measure personality. So we've talked a lot about the different theories of personality and how we might kind of organize or structure this, but now we're going to talk specifically about how we measure personality actually in the real world. So let's first talk about the first method, and probably the most common method that we use, especially today, are objective self-report techniques. So this is basically just using surveys and questionnaires to present questions and get measurements on these different personality traits and inventories. For example, we have like the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. We might have like the Ocean or the Big Five personality type, where we measure those different personality traits. But these are generally just self-report techniques where people will fill out a survey answering questions, and those questions lead to measurements on these different traits of personality. These tend to be pretty easy, pretty fast and well formatted, and they also are pretty consistent from one person to another. So we can present the same format, the same inventory to multiple people, and so we're having some reliability there in how we're getting that assessed from person to person. Of course, we have maybe the potential limitation of seeing people's self-assessment, which could have some bias in it, or people could be biased in how they're responding to these questions. But generally speaking, I think with personality, we see a lot of kind of consistency in how these reports tend to be shown. Second technique here is this projective technique, or basically looking at personality from more of these early approaches. So things like the Freudian approach. And these would do more of ways to kind of look at the unconscious or get at this unconscious piece or part of personality. These are not really used as much today, but we can see these techniques and talk about them from more of these early approaches. So things like the association techniques, where we might have someone associate a word with a feeling, or an ink blot test with some type of feeling or imagery. And these could then be interpreted by the therapist or the psychologist to then provide meaning as to what that had to do with their personality. So you can see again, now we're introducing not only bias in the person responding, but bias in the therapist interpreting that response as well. Then we have construction techniques, which are more where people have to maybe construct a story around some type of object or image or some type of thing. And then we observe how that story kind of plays into their personality and how they're constructing it, sort of from a creative point of view. Again, similar problems where now we're introducing bias in how we interpret those results and what meaning we provide to those through the therapist's eyes or the therapist's lens. So these are techniques, again, less used today, but more used from this early on perspective of sort of the psychodynamic or psychoanalysis point of view. And then lastly, we have the physiological or the psychophysiological assessment techniques. And these are ways that we assess the biology or the biological components that we've talked about being associated with personality. So we might use different ways of measuring physiological aspects like heart rate, muscle tension, or other kind of components that we have associated with different personality traits. Maybe we look at hormones or neurotransmitters, or maybe some genetic characteristics as well. Maybe we use different neuroimaging to look at like activation in different regions of the brain to associate with personality at different times. Maybe we use cortical measures like EEG to measure activity in different regions of the brain, or things like that as well. So these are other techniques that we can use and associate and pair those with personality as well. Oftentimes, though, I will say that these are usually paired with things like self-report techniques in ways to kind of get other measures of personality and then pair and associate them with the biological side of things here as well. And so the last thing I want to talk about here is just some kind of concluding remarks on personality overall. As you can see, sort of the 5 different approaches we've talked about throughout this chapter, and some different kind of ways of using them and what they kind of get at. So we have the psychodynamic approach, which was the Freudian perspective, and again, looked at more of the unconscious. Maybe some drawbacks to that is that we're not really involved in the process. We're not aware of what's going on. And there's a lot of bias introduced both from the individual and the therapist as well. Then we have the humanistic perspective, which really brought in this more positive aspect of psychology and of people, where we're saying people are trying to be the best that they can be, and they create and drive their personality to accomplish those types of goals. Then the social cognitive perspective was, again, looking at how we have different observations and social components of people and ourselves, and how we form cognitions and thoughts and feelings around those, and we strive to sort of perform to the best of our abilities. We use things that work well, and we stop doing or using behaviors and techniques that don't work as well. And then we have the biological perspective, which we talked about some different components of biology, like the ARAS, and how that can vary from different individual personality components, like introversion versus extroversion. And then lastly, we have the trait perspective, which is probably the most utilized version today, which is looking at specific traits of personality and measuring those along their dimensions to create specific personality profiles or compounds of these different traits to show how people sort of frame and format a personality as a whole. For example, like the Big Five, where we looked at those 5 different components or traits of personality. And so each of these kind of has a different technique and a different history to it. And we can see some pros and cons and some value to each of these in learning and understanding personality. But they are all different theories that kind of go together and touch on a different part of personality. So again, it might depend on what you're trying to know and what you're trying to assess in terms of personality, which of these theories might work the best for your goal.